fish a lot of suspended fish?
What's that?
Do you fish a lot of suspended fish like in the middle of the lake?
I do fish suspended fish all the time, but it's always trolling techniques.
Yeah,
whether it's spinner fishing behind, you know, using like an offshore tadpole or an offshore snap weight to get the spinners down there, or an inline weight type of thing, or we use crankbaits a lot. Again, you need to get that app. How many people got precision trolling app? So you need to look at that. It costs a little bit of money, but I know you Canadians got a lot of money. So I'll pass this around. You can look at one. I've got this one. So the precision trolling app basically has about 400 lures now on it. You can go to like a Flicker Minnow 9, and you can tell it I'm using 10XT, or you can tell it I'm using lead core or whatever, and you say I want to go down 25 feet. It tells you to let out 91 feet of line with lead core. If you got XT and you want to, and you're seeing suspended fish, we were talking suspended, maybe they're 20 foot down, you see them suspended, and you know you want to fish above suspended fish. So you want to run some baits at 19 and 16 and 14, see where they're going to bite above it. You can just, okay, I want some 16 foot, 9 flicker minnow, let out 74 feet of line. So real quickly put your baits right where they've got to be. A lot of people, I'll pass this around so you can all kind of look at it if you want. I would like my phone back, but a lot of people, what was I just going to say? I don't know. One thing I will tell you that's interesting, here's what I was going to say. A lot of people don't realize that the way that all the data was captured for that is an actual diver going down and looking at a tape measure underwater as the bait goes by. It's monotonously horrid to do. I did it one day with the guys down in the saltwater. We're starting to touch some saltwater ones. And it's like you let out 25 feet of line, you go by the tape measure. Then you let out 50 feet of line, and you got to start far enough out so the bait is, and then you go by the tape measure, and then you let out 100 feet of line, and you go, and you do that over and over again. And then you do that for mono, you do it for fire line, you do it for lead core, and you do it for snap weight data. And it's this monotonous, horrid kind of stuff, but it's the good data. It's all good data. And then we take 5 different data points and make a mathematical curve on it. And so you got real precise data for just about any depth. But that's how you get your baits in the right zone. One question a lot of people ask was, well, what if I'm going like with 10XT with monofilament line? What if I speed up? How's that going to affect things? What's interesting is you can go anywhere from about 1.5 all the way up to about 3.5, and that bait will not change more than an inch or two. Because as you go faster, it's trying to dig harder, but you also get a lot more resistance on your line as you're going faster, and it holds up the bait a little. So it's very, very accurate for a bunch of different speeds. For the techniques like lead core or putting a snap weight in front of a bait, then there's actually a little wheel you can adjust the speed and see what difference it makes. Slower is going to be deeper, faster is going to be higher.
How far do you put your snap weight ahead of your lure?
All of the data on there, which is what most of us use, is you let out a 50-foot leader, you put on a 2-ounce snap weight, and then you let out some more dropper to get it to the different depths. So it's always a 50-foot leader. You want to get it a little away from that snap weight because that can spook fish.
Yeah. What about 3-way then?
3-way?
Yeah.
Well, I don't troll very much with 3-ways. On a river I might, like if I was in front of a wing dam or something like that. But if, I'll run a tadpole in front of I don't even run tadpole. Snap weights in front of it, or lead core is what we run in front of crankbaits. Spinners, you might put a tadpole, an inline weight, a snap weight, and things like that.
Snap or lead?
Huh?
Do you like snap or lead better?
For open water fishing, I like snap weight. For structure fishing, where I'm trying to run a contour and run the baits real close to the bottom, I like lead core.
Okay.
Yeah. Just because lead core follows the boat a little bit better. Snap weights, if you make too hard of a turn, the snap weight drops really fast and then pulls the bait too low and it'll be rubbing in the bottom too quick. Whereas lead core, kind of 18-pound lead core, it's kind of got enough thickness to it that it'll follow along the contour and you can keep the bait in the same zone even though you're making turns.
Does all water have suspended fish?
What?
Does all water have suspended fish?
Does all water have suspended fish? I would say the only place a lot of times you don't see suspended fish is in current in a river. I guess just holding up in the current is hard for them to do. I mean, there's times here when they'll actually be up in the water column, but they're actually just drifting with the current, like migrating off of a spawn or something like that. So they're not really holding there to eat, they're just using it as a way to travel down the river. But for the most part, when walleyes suspend, what they're doing is there's some kind of bait out there up high, and they just sit down below the bait, wait for it to swim over, and then they swim up and eat it. So the idea is to run a spinner or a crankbait above where they're sitting, kind of like to fool, to be like the bait. What's interesting is a lot of times if you see bait and you see walleyes below it, you don't want to run your bait through the bait, through the actual bait, because it'll bust up the bait and then they kind of get spooked or something. So you actually run above the bait even. So you have walleyes, bait, and then you run your crankbaits above that, and if it's clear enough water, they'll come all the way up through the bait to get yours. So it's different. Suspended fishing is just something, you gotta get boards, you gotta get your boat lines away from the boat, you gotta get those baits in the right zone above where you're seeing marks, and then you just spend a lot of time. The one thing about open water fish is, they aren't like when I talk about shiver minnow fishing, where you graph and you see a bait, a fish, you might try and pitch or get that fish. You don't do that with open water fish. You literally have to run it by tens or hundreds or maybe thousands of fish before one bites. It's just a lot more of a numbers game. That's why down in Wisconsin, we can run 3 lines a person. Up here with one line, it's a little tougher. You take your kids and your grandkids and anybody who's got a license, you take them out with you, and you load up the sides, and that's how you learn how to do it. So, but it is all lure placement, and that's the tricky part about it. Drive around, mark your fish, and fish above those marks. That's the best advice I can give you on open water fish. Don't put it right in their face. Fish above them. Clearer the water, the higher above them. We have a lot of fish come up 15, 20 feet above them. They're down in 40, and we're running our base in 20, and they'll come up and get it.
What about downriggers?
Downriggers, so for the people who don't, downrigger's a big ball with a wire. It's got releases, so you run your line down the side of the wire, clip it in the release, and then your bait is running behind here. What we found is in most places, Lake of the Woods maybe is an exception, Lake Erie is maybe an exception. In most places, the hum of the wire or the ball bothers walleyes. I would not use it. I haven't run a downrigger in my entire career for walleyes. I will run a snap weight or lead core on structure. I just think they're a little more finessey, and I can get a snap weight down. Rarely is a suspended walleye deeper than, say, 50 feet. Because at 50 feet, you typically in the summer will get a thermocline if you are that deep. Even in eastern Lake Erie, it's 100 feet deep, we fish down about 45 because the thermocline's in 50. And rarely will you see active fish below the thermocline. Right close to it, yes, but below it, no. So with a snap weight, I can easily get down any crankbait to 50 feet, especially at walleye streams. Now salmon fishing, you're moving so fast, you need a big ball. But salmon are a different breed. I mean, they're much more aggressive, much more predatory, I'll call it.
So walleye fishing, can you estimate what percentage of time you use using live bait versus crankbait, etc.?
So the question is what percentage of time do I use live bait as compared to unlive bait, which is like a shiver, a crankbait, all that? I would say if you would ask me that 20 years ago, it would be easily 50-50. I ran a lot of crankbaits. Tournaments are won with crankbaits, a lot. Now, it's probably 5% live bait. I rarely fish live bait. I just do not hardly think of it. I don't carry it. I don't even usually have it. Now, there are cases when, maybe you really need it. Like it sounds like you go over to Nipwin where you got 100 people in a little area. You need a nice big leech and just hope one swim by and get you. I mean, it is what it is, right? But for meat tournaments, I can't think of the last time I used. Now, the exception to that is crawlers on spinners. Yeah. It seems like there isn't yet, Berkeley won't like me saying this, but there isn't yet a good artificial crawler that does what a live one does on a spinner. There are good ones like Slow Death. Live crawlers work great on Slow Death, but I'd pick a killer crawler, the little gulp killer crawler, way before I pick a live crawler. Now, I do run live crawlers at times because it seems like that's what the fish want, but more often than not, I'm going to run a killer crawler, a 3-inch fry, a 4-inch gulp crawler is a really good one. It kind of got a different look to it behind those, slow turn or slow depth type rigs. Artificial is just, I think, better. It stays on better. the little fish can't peck it away, and I'm just more efficiently fishing. And that spinning crawler or spinning killer crawler, I don't think they tell that much difference.
When you're pulling blades and crawlers like you're talking about, I've got a technique I try, maybe I'm a little out to lunch here, but when I do fish a lot of Tobin nip, when they're a little spooky, I mean, they've been caught 100 times, most of them. I went to like a bottom bounce, I went to just a straight lead color bouncer because I don't like using color because it's an attractant, right? And I've increased my lead to 7 feet. And I find it in clarity, like out in the lake when it's clear, if I'm fishing in a bunch of people, I'm out fishing like 3 to 1 a lot of the time. And I think that's just like when you're pulling the rigs, you're a long way from the disturbance of your presentation versus the actual bait.
Yeah, I mean, his question is about leader length, whether that's behind a bottom bouncer or a rig or anytime you're looking at leaders. I have seen where when you have pressured fish, that longer leaders can make a big difference, especially in cleaner water. We saw that way back in the 90s in Mille Lacs. We'd go down there and we'd be all running our 4-foot leaders. Why does everybody run a 4-foot leader? Because then they can hook the hook in their rod, right? That's why everybody runs a 4-foot leader. But they were running like 7-foot leaders, so they had to wrap it down, around, and in and out, and try and run the. But those 7 and 8 and 10-foot leaders caught more fish. The other thing about long leaders, sometimes what you can get, especially if you're live bait fishing like a minnow or a leech, not necessarily a crawler, even a crawler, I'll tell you how, that long leader sometimes will let them swim up off the bottom more.
A little bit, yeah.
They'll actually be above the weight. And so especially we saw that a lot on a lot of lakes when we have bug hatches. Because the bugs are kind of coming up through the water column. So what we do is start moving really slow to let that leech swim up a little. Or we'd inflate crawlers so that the crawler would be coming up through the water column. So we'd move a little, it would pull the bait down, and then it would naturally swim or float back up. Sometimes in bug hatches that can be real good, but you need to use then a long, light line leader.
This one more, do you think, like I use a lot of 2-color blades, like, you know, front to back, and I keep a lot of records on this stuff, but if I'm catching fish on the front hook of a crawler harness, are they seeing the top of the blade and they're coming from the side, do you think, versus the ones that you catch on the back hook are getting the reflection of the beads off that back color of the blade, or is that a little bit too much overthinking?
Sounds like a lot of overthinking. Wally's brain is about that big. Now I do think that it could be that, you know, maybe they like the flash better and they're coming up behind.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's just the way the fish is biting.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
when a fish is real aggressive, front hook. You'll see it,
Yeah.
front hook on a shiver minnow, front hook on a crankbait, front hook on the spinner.
Yeah.
The more aggressive the fish, the further up on the nose of the bait they bite. When they're biting the back, they're kind of coming behind it, not quite sure, maybe nipping a little, kind of, oh shoot, I got hooked, you know. So I think it's more the mood of the fish or how aggressively they're hitting, more than maybe even the attractant itself. But it could be, I do believe in that the flash, the metallic flash on the inside. I typically don't like fully painted blades.
No.
I like one side to be holographic. I love multicolor. And I like the backside to be some kind, and I do pay attention to what color, is it silver, is it gold, is it copper, what color is that metallic back there, because that can make a big difference. Good question. Bogey.
Hey Keith, when you're pulling cranks, what makes you decide what you're gonna pull? A minnow, shad, or you know, your different.
Yeah. So the question is how do you decide which one? If you got all these crankbaits to choose from, how do you actually choose what you're going to run down there? I think a couple of things go into my selection. First of all, I kind of look at what the fish are usually eating in the system. If it's something like shad or bluegill or something brown, then I'm going to go with more of the shad baits. If it's like smelt or the longer, you know, shiner type bait or something like, then I'm going to go with the minnow at first. Again, we're real lucky down in this. I mean, we can run multiple rods, so I'm never going to put them all out shad. I'm always going to put some minnows out, some shad, but I might lean towards one or the other. The other thing, of course, is size, the size of the bait. What I'm typically looking at there, again, is what they're used to eating. So I'm going to go, you know, smaller if they're early in the spring and they're eating smaller bait. If they got a lot of Cisco and stuff around, I might go to a bigger bait. And the other thing that affects how big of a bait I'm going to run is what I'm actually targeting. Now, all of us target big fish, you know, we're all trying for big fish, But there's just a lot of lakes where you're gonna catch mainly 3-pound fish. The last thing you wanna do on a 3-pound fish is run an 11-centimeter bait. It's just so big that you're gonna cut down on the number of bites you're gonna get. Much better to run a 5 or a 7, a much smaller bait, because those smaller eater type fish are gonna bite those. So, you know, go big if you got big fish, go big if you got big bait, but otherwise those smaller ones are all, a big fish will always bite, can always bite a smaller bait, but a little fish can't bite a big bait all the time. So if you're just out to catch fish, by far the littler baits are gonna be your better choice as far as just flat out fish catchers. A number 5 flicker minnow is just a sick, good bait, almost anywhere you run it. A number 7 flicker shad is just really hard to beat as far as just flat out catching fish.
So if you're gonna be running, say, in a tournament, and you're smoking along, so you want that big fish, so you're gonna look for a bigger bait to...
Well, again, his question is, if you're in a tournament, you're looking for a big fish, put on a big bait. Yeah, but that's kind of swinging for the fence, right? If during pre-fishing, if I was at Diefenbaker the last few days, and all I'm catching is 22 inchers, 21 inch, or whatever I'm gonna keep those, you know, and I'm gonna start targeting those, because that's all. Do I just go for a big fish? So you always gotta look at what fish are you most likely gonna catch. Now if you got a chance by running a big bait and it catches some big fish, then you do it. But if you like ran big baits all week in pre-fishing, thinking that on tournament day I'll keep running it, hope I get into that. We like those guys in the tournament.
Fill the well first.
What
Yeah.
about rattling cranks, jigging now? I see some stuff nowadays about guys,
Lipless crankbaits.
yes.
Okay, so lipless crankbaits is the question. What do I think about those? There are definite times for those. It tends I think that like earlier in the year, shiver minnowing typically doesn't take off most places till the water gets up 60, 65 degrees, a little bit warmer, because it is such an aggressive technique. A good technique before that, when the fish are on structure, is running the lipless crankbaits, the ribbon wraps, there's some Seville ones, there's some Strike King makes a nice one, the red. I mean, there's several of them out there. The key with those is again, it's a little bit different how you fish them. You don't fish them like a jig and you don't fish them like a shiver. You make a pretty good sweep up, and the nice thing is a good one will activate very quickly. And what I mean by that is they barely get off the bottom and they're shaking already. You know, you use them, Winnipeg, up in Winnipeg, they use them all the time, the rattling baits, and the good ones, right away as soon as you're lifting, you can feel it rattle. But you want to do that, and it's the same thing as shiver minnow fishing. You drive around, you find them on structure, you cast to them, and then you just lift up and you feel, and then the key is to start to let unlike a jig where you might just hold it there and let the bait swim down, we found that it's actually better to lift it up and then drop your rod tip, and at the same rate your rod tip is going down, reeling down with it. So you're kind of keeping it tight. You're not giving it a slack line going down. It's not necessarily tight, it's kind of semi-slack going down. And what that does is, I think, keeps that little bit of tension on the line, it keeps that bait swimming straight. If you give it too much slack, those baits just want to kind of, you know, they don't keep swimming. If you hold it tight, they don't shimmy enough coming down. So it's a and it's the same thing. And a lot of times they'll pin it to the bottom. Other times as you're reeling down, it's actually a tight enough line that you'll feel them ticket and just set the hook. So they are a good bait. They're a very good bait. But typically once summer comes on, the more aggressive glide baits are going to be a better option. But earlier than you would use a glide bait, like in Green Bay, we use them in April. You know, it's 35-degree weather. You wouldn't think that they would go after that aggressive of a bait, but they do. But think about it, you're using them in Winnipeg in the middle of winter. So it's the same kind of thing. It's just that vibration. The good ones will have a high-pitched rattle in them, lots of rattles. So when they do activate, they're throwing off a lot of sound. A lot of times early in the year, the water's dirtier just from winds and things like that. So that sound is real good. So they are not only a visual bait, but they have plenty of sound in them to actually draw fish to them. So definitely something you want to do, but it's a little bit shorter window on when you'll actually use them.
How about Nipawin River right now, dirty?
Well, dirty in the Nipawin River, maybe. I'd probably switch to a blade bait before I would use a rip and wrap, though. You know, some kind of a sonar type bait that's still got that vibration, but it fishes a little faster. Them glide baits drop pretty slow, So I want a little bit more aggressiveness when it's dropping down. And that's what, when you're fishing a blade bait, it's the same thing. You're going on the way up, but then you just hold it and they got enough weight that they'll shimmy down the right way. It's almost like jig fishing. And shimmy down, shimmy down. So I would probably use a blade bait this time of year over a lipless crankbait. But they certainly could work. I mean, they can work anytime. I think I would lean towards a blade bait. There you go. What else?
Come on, fire away.
Keith, have you ever pulled number 4 flicker shads behind bottom bouncer with a 4-foot lead on them?
Have I ever pulled 4 flicker shads behind a bottom bouncer with a 4-foot lead? I have pulled flicker shads, 4s and 5s, behind a short lead, but I will typically put on a snap weight. I'll run a snap weight like 6 foot ahead to get a little bit of a separation, but a bottom bouncer is fine. I'll tell you one thing we do a fair amount of is we'll run a small crankbait behind a 3-way where the bottom half is a jig. Now I don't know if you can do that. Can you do that? You use a heavy jig going up to a 3-way back to a, so that's a really good technique. What's interesting is a lot of people think that when you run a 3-way, a jig down here, good sized jig, a 3/4 ounce jig to maybe that long a line to a 3-way and then back like maybe that far to a crankbait, that when you're trolling that along and working it, a lot of people might think that that actually looks like a 3-way, like a live bait 3-way, but it doesn't. As soon as you start dragging it, that jig will swing up and it's actually running right equal with the line coming to the crankbait. Even a heavy jig, because you're moving along fast enough with that crankbait, and what's happening is that jig is still acting as a weight, so it's helping it get down, and the crankbait is helping the jig get down, so they're both kind of helping each other get down. And so when you sweep it forward, the jig is running right with the line, and as soon as you back up, that jig falls down. And you'll get a lot of bites as you're going backwards, because that jig is kind of falling with like a twister tail or something on it. And so that's a great way to fish in current. It's also a great way to fish just any kind of structure. You just kind of move around, you put it on fire line, and you just basically sweep it forward, and your crankbait should be close to the bottom, but then when you back it up slowly, that jig will be fluttering down and they'll bite it on the way down. And you can tell the difference in the bite when you get them. The crankbait will just kind of be a mush-on bite. The jig will be like, it just rattles it. Like that falling with a twister tail and stuff, it just upsets them. Whoa, they'll bite it really hard. So I do more of that. I would say a 3-way with a heavy jig, or if I want to just run a weight in front of the bait, I'll run a snap weight. I just a little bit more comfortable running the snap weight.
Well, we found with the bottom bouncers, a lot of times you're getting a lot more snags.
Through the snags and
because
stuff.
you're letting out more line, the bottom bouncer lays down, the bottom, and in the weeds, short weeds on the bottom, you catch up, but we have really good success on Long Lake doing that.
Oh,
We have
I mean, it's just, again, a matter of getting that bait in the right zone. If a bottom bouncer does that, or a snap weight, or whatever you're using, you're doing the right way. I mean, if the fish bite it, you're doing the right thing. I mean, I'm not going to tell you anybody, if you're catching fish, you're doing the right thing. That's flat out how walleye fishing is. Like I said before, I mean, a lot of us overthink walleye fishing. We think, oh, we got to have X, and perfect this, and perfect that, and perfect color, and then they're a stupid fish. I mean, they're not smart at all. They aren't thinking. They behave. They want to eat. We put something in that kind of looks like something they want to eat. They eat it. And so a lot of times we all overthink it a little bit. Pokey loves when we all overthink it because we buy way too many colors and things. Good for him. A rich guy now from all of us. And the lure companies certainly thank us all. But a lot of times we overthink. And if it's something as simple as a bottom bouncer with a right kind of bait behind it and it's in the right zone, keep doing it. Keep doing it. Yeah. All right. What else?
If you're jig fishing,
Yeah.
say you're fishing like plastics as opposed to live bait, like are you going to work that quite a bit differently or fairly similarly?
Okay, so his question is, if you're jig fishing, are you going to work the bait similar to like you do with live bait, or if you go to some kind of a tail, are you going to work it differently? So there's actually two different ways that I jig. You know, if I'm jigging with a real minnow, a lot of times, and it's working, a lot of times I want to still fish an artificial. So I try to pick a tail that looks very natural. Like I might pick a 3-inch gulp minnow that looks just like the minnow I'm putting on there. Because if I can run artificial, there's a lot less chance he can pluck it off. I don't have to rebait as much. I'm just being more efficient. So anytime, if I'm somebody in the boat's fishing with a minnow and they're catching them, I'm gonna try a bunch of artificial tails first. But I'm gonna fish them just like I am the real bait. And slow lifts, let it kind of swim down, hit the bottom, slow lifts. When I go to tail, what I call an action tail, I do it different. A lot of times, and what I mean by an action tail is maybe something like a ripple shad, which has the paddle in back, or maybe a grub type thing with the twister tail in back. When you're fishing those kind of things, I think you want to fish them more aggressively. I think you want to put on a heavier jig than you would. If you're throwing a minnow on an 1/8 ounce jig up in the shallows, I might go to a 1/4 ounce. Because a lot of times what you want is a jig that when you're going to pull it up, you'll feel that vibration of that tail, but then you want the jig falling fast enough that it continues to move the tail. If you use too light of a jig on some of these action tails, as it's following, the tail isn't moving the way it should. Whereas that little bit heavier jig will actually keep that tail moving on the way down, make it look like it's swimming on the way down. The other beauty of that is, with a 1/4 ounce jig, I can move a lot faster. I can cover more water, I can fish deeper faster, I can cast, it sinks quicker, so I can be much more efficient again. So anytime you're using an action tail, go to a heavier jig and work it faster. If you need to work really slow though, then you go to ones that look like what you're fishing with, that's a crawler, not real good leeches out there, or a minnow, and just fish it just like you would a live bait. Good question.
Do you like the artificial leeches or not really?
Next question. No, I don't think there's a good artificial leech. I think a leech is kind of like a crawler spinner. When you put a crawler on a spinner harness, the thing is kind of like moving and undulating, and I think that makes it kind of, it doesn't get into a pattern. So like with Berkeley, we've been trying to design worms with a little bit of a curl to it. But then what they do is they just spin kind of like slow death. And it seems like behind a spinner you don't want that. You want this undulation that's kind of weird. It's kind of like when you put a crawler on and you run it for an hour and you're wondering why you ain't getting no fish. It's because it's just sitting there straight as can be. It's not scrunching up and curl. You want to keep those crawlers fresh on your spinner so it's always kind of moving different attitude. Same thing with a leech. When you fish a leech on a jig, you pitch it out there. A lot of times it hits the bottom and that leech is kind of still moving around and stuff. I think that's what attracts fish to a leech, is that movement. You get you fish it for, again, an hour and you just got this lump of black behind there, you just don't get as many bites. So I think a leech on a jig and a crawler on a spinner, you need that liveliness, and I don't think anybody's figured out how to mimic that with artificials yet. Minnows, I've seen it all the time, I can mimic it. Crawlers, definitely. Crawler's an easy one on a jig to mimic. So. Good. What else?
Have you played with the jointed flicker shads much?
I was the one who tested them. The jointed flicker shads, I'm sure you've all seen them now. They came out just last September, I think now. What was interesting about them is I fished jointed baits a long time. A jointed bait has a much more snaky action in the water, which, by the way, most shad baits don't have any kind of snakiness. With a shad bait, any kind of, the flicker shads, the shad wrap, whatever kind of shad baits, what you look for there is top to bottom roll. A good rolling bait, not a wobbling bait or a snaky bait. You want a top to bottom roll with a shad bait. With a stick bait, like the flicker minnows, what you want there is a little bit of roll and a little bit of snakiness. It's kind of a dual action. It's not just roll. First flicker minnows we designed, we thought we had the world on fire. We had this rolling minnow bait that nobody else had. I mean, we worked on it, and here's this beautiful rolling bait, and we trolled it, and basically the walleye said, wrong. Nothing to do with it. We couldn't hardly catch a fish on it. But then we started to think about it. Well, every stick bait I've ever seen kind of snakes through the water and rolls a little bit. So that's what we had the guys design next, and then it lights out. Once you figured out you needed a certain amount of snakiness and enough roll to get the rattles working, a little bit of side flash, that's what really made those baits produce, and the walleyes loved them. So with the jointed, what's interesting about a jointed, whenever you joint a bait, it gets a natural snakiness. And so it's kind of going against the shad bait roll that we always think about. It's got much more snakiness. What was interesting was is that I've always thought of a jointed bait as a midsummer bait, very aggressive, got that tail whipping around back there. What we found out though in testing is like right away in April when I started trolling with them, I was catching fish. And the reason is because I could troll them really slow. I could go down to 1.5, 1.2, and they still had a great action underwater. So we just had to slow down. And as summer came, we speed up, let them really kind of wiggle down there and snake down there, and they were catching fish. So it was the first jointed bait that had a much bigger window of opportunity. Typically, it was jointed baits for summertime, warm water. These you can run all the way spring to fall, just slow down a little bit in the cooler water. So jointed baits have been, they're actually one of my favorite baits now. I mean, I almost throw a jointed down before I throw a regular flicker shad down just because I like the action. The one thing that was really cool too is we were able to convince Berkeley to put the fire tails on. So the body is one color and then you put like a bright orange or a red or some other color tail back there. That made a huge difference. We just saw in testing, it was unbelievable how that little bit of color in the back whipping around just seemed to make them want to bite. And they were all on the back hook. I mean, we talked about hooks, where they bite. Everything was on the back hook, like they were aiming for that little piece of color back there. So we actually now, they just came out with the fire tail, like flicker minnows and flicker shads. I think on the flicker minnows it's going to be more important because again it has a little snakiness where the back little chunk of the tail is fire, different like an orange or a bright color back there, and then you got a regular colored body. So I think those will be real good too. So, but I really like the jointed. The shallow ones are a great bait. What was interesting about the shallow flicker shads is that we were able to take a shallow running bait and give it the exact same roll as its deep running brother, I'll call it. The 7 flicker shad and the deep and the shallow both have the same roll rate, which I thought was pretty cool that you could get that out of that little tiny, much smaller bill that doesn't dive as deep. So if you're doing any kind of shallow casting or even running behind, running behind weights and stuff, those shallow ones are actually a really, really good bait.
You ever tip it with a crawler?
Okay, so tipping a crankbait with a crawler is something that I got my butt kicked in tournaments a lot of years by a couple of guys. They were doing it for a lot of years and I don't know why I didn't think of it. Basically what you do is one of two ways. You can either put it on the belly hook. When you're putting it on the belly hook of a crankbait, always make sure you take that treble hook and look at it. And there'll either be one treble pointing straight ahead or one, or right behind, just based on how they put the treble hook on. You always want it on that forward or back facing hook. If you get it off on one of the side ones, it makes the bait tip and they run like out of tune. But if you get it on the front, it doesn't make as much difference. Or you can put a little chunk on the back tail, and it just basically makes it a jointed bait. It makes that, as that tail wiggles, that crawler sitting back there kind of snaking behind it. What's interesting is I think that belly one, I always thought maybe it's a little bit of scent or the little bit of extra stuff down there. I really believe what that hook, especially that belly hook crawler does, is make the bait what I call hunt. It'll be running along and all of a sudden that belly hook will make it kind of kick out of tune. And all of a sudden the bait will be, does one of those deals. And I think walleyes a lot of time are falling behind that, and when they see this little, oh geez, it's time, And I think that's what that belly hook does. And there's baits, reef runners, for instance. If you've ever run a reef runner and you watch it in the water, all of a sudden, for no particular reason, And we've tried to design lures to do that. The problem is they're also very, very hard to tune because you can't get them in tune. You run them one way, you run them. So for the typical fisherman, a crankbait out of tune is just unacceptable. So that's why it's very hard to design that. But put that little crawler under there, and all of a sudden it's doing that little hunt. That can be a really good thing. And you can put a real crawler down there. You can put a part of a little piece of gold crawler, anything down there. It'll do the same kind of thing. The back one, I think, just makes it look longer and snakier.
Okay.
But it's always just a little chunk. You don't want like a full crawler back there.
Keith, I just came back from Manitoba, and zebra mussels are a big issue over there. It's not unthinkable to think that it won't work up the chain to us. How have you seen that affect where you are, and what can we expect in the future? How's that going to change on the Red River? I caught one that was just a monster.
Right. So just for the record, by the way, out of my truck, I'm officially zebra mussel free, right? I had the inspection at the border, just so y'all know. Zebra mussel free. We actually pay a lot of attention in the US about that too. I mean, we have to have plugs out, we have to have drain, we have to have dry stuff, you know. So, you know, it does affect how things fish. Zebra mussels, first of all, will typically make walleye fishing better. It's not something people like to hear, but it's actually, every place I've seen it, it's the truth. I mean, Lake Erie, where we first saw it, all of a sudden it cleared up quite a bit. It was kind of a dingy, stained, polluted kind of lake, and the zebra mussels cleared it up, and all of a sudden this fishing was just fabulous. It also makes a great spawning area for walleyes because they spawn before the zebra mussels wake up in the spring. So with all these big areas of zebra mussels became great spawning areas. That being said, do I think you should put zebra mussels in any lake? Absolutely not. It changes how things happen. What you'll see a lot of times is cleaner water, which will mean a lot of times more weeds, and the walleyes will start to use the weeds a lot more. You'll see a lot more suspended fish in cleaner water. You just got to start fishing, you know, instead of, like Lake Erie, they used to do a lot of casting, wait forward spinners. All of a sudden they couldn't cast enough to get it far enough away from the boat because the water was so clean. So we had to start trolling. So it does change how things work. You know, I'm not a scientist or anything. It's hard to stop zebra mussels. Birds can carry them around. Animal, you know, just the larvae can be in water or anything. So it's going to be hard to stop it. It happens. It's not detrimental to walleye fishing as far as I can tell. Probably detrimental to the fishery, to the water though. You know, gets in pipes, gets on boats. They're kind of mean little buggers, but they clean things up, I'll tell you that. Yeah.
Any night fishing?
I do night fishing, not as much as I used to, because it's miserable. Trying to tie now, it's hard enough during the day to tie, let alone with a little light on your head. But I do some night fishing. The thing about night fishing is typically the fish are up. What I like to do is key around moons, of course. Full moon. I hate full moons as a tournament fisherman because I know they've been eating all night. And I'm going to wake up in the morning and try and catch fish that are chock full from the night. So because I worry about that the next day after a full moon, I know if I fished the night before, I could probably do pretty well. So shallower is first of all the thing. Most of the time it's crankbait fishing. Fish at the night will come up on shallower structure than they will during the day, and they're up there to eat. When they get up into 7, 8, 10 feet of water, they're there to eat. Doesn't matter if the water's gin clear or if it's dirty. You can run a crankbait line typically, and they listen to them. I think rattling baits are really good for that. Stick baits are really good. The rope type baits with the rattles in them and things like that, I think are real good. Just trolling though, just long line trolling mostly, no boards, typically on structure. I don't fish boards ever on structure really. When I'm fishing during the day on structure with crankbait, I don't fish boards. I fish long rods out the side. I fish some shorter rods down the middle. I run lead core on some and fire line on other ones to get them down to the right depth and spread them out a little bit down there. Running them real close to the bottom. Whenever you're on structure, fish the bottom, real close to the bottom. If you're out suspended, then you can fish above the marks you see. So, the night fishing always structure on the bottom.
I had a question, Keith, in regards to what type of rod do you like using? What kind of length when you're trolling with lead core?
Lead core trolling. Like I said, when I'm fishing lead core, what I'm typically fishing is structure. And what I mean by that is I might be fishing a long shoreline, I might be fishing a bigger reed. I'm not fishing real little small spots. Like the spots we were shivering on aren't really good for cranking because they're so short and they're so steep. I mean, you're looking for longer stretches of shorelines or reefs or some kind of structure. And what you're trying to do is keep those baits real close to the bottom. So when I'm fishing lead core, what I will typically fish is 2 10-foot rods, 9.5 10-foot rods straight out the side in rod holders, and then I'll try and fish 2 rods down the middle. Now, if you're just starting to do it, obviously don't run 4 rods because you'll get tangles and things like that if you aren't used to it. Or if you just literally can't, I would just run the 2 rods out the side just to get a little bit of a spread. The only thing to remember on that is that typically one side of the boat is going to have lures running a little bit shallower than the other side. So on the deep side, you might have to let out a little bit more line to get them the same distance to the bottom. Like if you want to run them from a foot from the bottom, the deeper side might need a little bit more line out. The other thing that I really pay attention to is if all the fish are coming on, say, the shallow side, the next pass I move everything in and then shorten out my lines a little bit, run everything in a little bit shallow. So kind of let the rods tell you, am I a little too deep, am I a little too shallow, where are the fish? If they're both running, you're in the right depth. If both your rods are catching fish, or in my case, if all four are catching fish.
Keith, have you ever run a spinner behind a crank?
Spinner behind a crank? Spinner behind a crank. No, I haven't.
Just try it.
I've tried lead core with spinners. What's interesting is it doesn't do very good. I think even running spinners on fire line doesn't, like a no stretch line isn't good for spinners. Because a lot of times those fish kind of come up behind it and grab it. And I think when you have a no stretch line, they get too much pull and they just open their mouth and you pull it out. So you need that stretch amount, so when they grab on, there's a little mushiness, you can see the bite, you can set the hook or see the board go back and start reeling and get the hooks actually set in. So for spinners, I fish mono. For cranks on structure, I fish fire line and no stretch lines. For out in open water crankbaits, it's all mono. I don't use fire line out in the open water. But combination things like that, you'll see guys doing that. And yeah, like I said, good. If you're catching fish, do it. You know, I just haven't seen it consistently produce. I will tell you one thing that does produce really well for a lot of people in open water is to take a small flutter type spoon, just a lightweight one though, not a real heavy spoon, a trolling spoon like they use for salmon, but a smaller one like a Wolverine spoon or a Silver Streak, something like that. And behind it, run about a 6-inch piece of line with a slow depth or slow turn hook, you know, spinning, and put the half crawler on there. So instead of a spinner system, you're actually using an attractor. Like a little spoon is an attractor, and behind that here's this little spinning. You need a snap swivel up here, so the swivel lets this thing spin back here. That can be really deadly, just absolutely deadly. And I've actually had guys running behind even bottom bouncers. If you're running spinners and bottom bouncers, you just got to make sure that spoon is real lightweight, because if it's too heavy, it's going to drag too low and on the bottom. But if you use a lightweight, real thin metal spinner, a blade, a spoon, that can be just deadly.
How do you catch the slow death behind the spoon?
Huh?
How do you attach
You just tie it up.
Right to the hook?
You have very nimble fingers, and you tie right to the hook, and you tie
Right to the hook.
a little 6-inch line. You don't want to get it too far back. You want it like tight in. So you put a snap swivel tied to that, and then tie to your slow death hook like you always would. But you only want to end up with a little leader behind that spoon, maybe 3 to 5 inches long. So they see that spoon, and then it's kind of like lake trout with Dodgers, right? The flashers are sitting there, and then behind it, a little ways, you run a fly, right? Well, it's the same kind of thing. It's instead of a fly, you use a slow turn or slow depth hook back there. Yeah.
For your board fishing, what's your favorite line for clipping to a board?
So his question is, when I'm board fishing, so I'm open water fishing, suspended fishing, what's my favorite kind of line? By far XT, 10XT. It sticks in the releases real well. All of the data on that app is with 10XT, so it makes sense to use that line. It's not a real expensive line, but it's a very durable line. You don't need a lot of sensitivity when you're trolling, so just a durable, consistent, strong line is what I want, and not something that costs an arm and a leg because you're filling up big reels with it. So 10XT is by far what and like I said, I'll take those same 10XT rods, and if I need to go deeper, I'd run out 50 foot, run a 2-ounce snap weight, and run that down. And there's getting to be more and more data on that app with that. They call it a 50+2 data. 50-foot leader, 2-ounce weight, and then you let out more line. One thing I'll tell you, if you're using that app with that, is when you're looking at if it says let out 100 feet of line, that means 100 total feet. 50, 2-ounce, 50. It says 70, it's 50, 2-ounce, 20. So it's always the total amount of line you have out. Always put the snap weight at 50 feet. But that's great data. That's fairly new data on that app, but it's data we're using all the time, because now I can run any crankbait any depth. If I think a number 5 flicker minnow is going to catch more fish 30 feet down, I can put it right there. You know, I don't have to worry that it doesn't dive that deep. I can put any bait any depth. So, good stuff.
That's everything? You guys get a lot out of this? I hope so. Well, I thank everybody for coming out. You know,
since early this morning.
We got
Probably
up
starving to death. We're gonna be around here for a while yet, so you just ask them any questions.
Sure.
Okay? You can walk around the store. We got lots of shiver minnows. We got lots of thicker minnows. Got a lot of, yeah, we got lots of cool stuff. So be here for a while. Hope you enjoyed it. It's always fun to bring Keith out here because he's, I mean, all these little tricks you guys learn. I mean, we've got a good tournament coming on last month in a couple of weeks. So hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for coming out tonight.
Yeah, thank you.